Okay, this is actually derived from a presentation I gave a couple of years ago. It's been expanded a bit since then at in Online Learning Consortium conference. That's not what I wanted to do right now. I wanted to present. There we go. And in any case, it's been updated. What is your definition of open pedagogy?
Mine?
I was going to ask everybody, but everybody is you.
Well, I think about, I sort of think about Paulo Freire and the idea that we're not feeding students information, that they are they're responding to the world and the things they read, but also sort of generating their own ideas and perspectives on it.
That's exactly the concept. That students are creating rather than just consuming content. They're actively engaged with the material. They're creating things themselves, and it's another aspect of it is that it's often shared. It could be just within the class or within a narrow community, but it often is shared for a wider audience, which could be the world. It could be for future students, and there's a lot of ways that can happen. It involves, as Paulo Freire would describe, well, we wouldn't have used the term active learning, but it's basically active learning. They're actively engaged with it. We don't have that banking model,
Right,
we don't have,
right.
We're not trying to pour information, and then we're having students actively construct their own knowledge. The non-disposable assignments that we talked about yesterday, but that's a big part of it. It has some value beyond just the class. And it also often involves some sort of a service learning component, because students are doing a service by creating materials that can help future generations of students or can help other people. Just some quick examples, because there's some resources I want to share. A simple example that can be done, and it's done pretty widely, is to have students annotate online content where they can go out and they can use social annotation software, things like Hypothesis, and annotate things on the web. And they could create resources and share resources and so forth that's annotated. Blogs is another way of doing open pedagogy, where students engage in writing which could be reflective blogs, or it could be blogs on specific topics. It could, depending on the discipline. Wikis are another way of doing that. One of my favorite examples of this was something I heard in a podcast, one of the Teaching in Higher Ed podcasts, where an instructor was teaching Portuguese to students in a Texas institution, I forget which one, and he had the students create a wiki page on their city for a Portuguese language wiki.
Nice.
So they were actually creating materials for it was a higher level language class,
Right.
but they were creating materials in Portuguese for Portuguese citizens or for Portuguese speakers by creating this wiki project. So wiki projects, and Wiki EDU sponsors them. It's part of the whole wiki group, and they do provide resources and support and so forth. And that's another good way of creating the service learning component, where you're creating something that people will be using. Glossaries are something that we've used quite a bit, that are quite often done for this. Maya Brown, before she left us, unfortunately, had her students create a glossary for, was it Shakespeare's tragedies? I forgot which it was, but basically of terms that were not familiar to students. She had them create glossaries of that, which then was shared as a public document so that future students would have that. Podcasts, as we talked about yesterday in a workshop, are another way. Video projects are another way of doing this. There was, again, another podcast example that I heard also on Teaching in Higher Ed, was a college chemistry class that had students create short videos on introductory chemistry that could be shared with high school students. They were actually using Flipgrid to do that. And when students are creating videos explaining concepts, they learn it so much more deeply than if they're just reading it for a test. Just as, many faculty have said, they really learn the material and the discipline when they first had to teach it, because you have to develop this deeper understanding to be able to explain it to other people. And it works the same way when students are doing that. Research is a little bit trickier, but a lot of people will have students do research and then publish it online. I say it's trickier because so much of that ends up coming back in our term papers and classes and things. And it can provide a pretty rich source for plagiarism, but it's also a good way of students doing some interesting work and sharing it more broadly. And just as it's easy for students to find that and then submit it to someone else's class, it's pretty easy for instructors to do that. But I've gotten so many econometrics term papers that have come over the years that were found on the web from students in other classes who had posted them. But in any case, students do feel good about sharing their work publicly.
May I ask a quick question?
Sure.
The glossaries, what forms, I've actually did this last year. I had students create glossaries, but it didn't really have I didn't have a way or form for them to circulate those. I'm interested to hear how those have been, like the case of the Shakespeare. What did that look like and how did it circulate?
That was being created with, I believe, the assistance of a librarian as a LibGuide or LibGuide. I don't know if that was ever finished, actually, though.
Okay.
A more common way is just to put it up on a website. Or it could be done on a WordPress blog or on, well, I suppose you could even use a Pressbook for it, but that would be a bit of overkill. But simply a website would be a good way of doing it.
Do you know who the librarian was who was working with her?
I think it was Laura Harris. I'm not positive.
Oh, okay.
We did a podcast with Maya about that. And at the time, it wasn't quite available yet, but it may be, well, that was a couple of years ago. So it probably is by now.
Great. Thank you.
And that's one way of doing it. But, a website's probably easier for most people to do on their own without requiring assistance. Books, as we talked about yesterday. And so, we've already addressed some of these before, so I don't want to go over it in much detail. For those who are watching this later, we talked about some of these things in 2 workshops yesterday on podcasts and on book creation projects. But open pedagogy projects motivate students quite a bit, that non-disposable assignment aspect of it. The public audience aspect of it is also something that creates a lot of intrinsic motivation. People don't want something posted publicly that they might be embarrassed by. And when they know that students are that other people will be looking at that and it has their name associated with it, it makes them much more, they take the project much more seriously. The first time I experienced anything like this was probably about 12 or 14 years ago when I had students, we had someone leave. I was the department chair and we needed someone to teach a course in history of economic thought. And I did have some background on it. So I put that together and then I looked at all the textbooks out there and they were really expensive. And yet all of the source materials have been out online for a decade or more at that point. So what I did is I had students create a wiki page or a wiki site on the history of economic thought. I made up a list of some of the major schools of thought and some of the major figures in that, and structured by time period primarily, well, by school of thought, but essentially they evolved over time. And then I had students create wiki pages on those where they had to create 3 of those. Each student had to create 3 of those over the course of the semester. And I said, these are going to be public and, people will be finding these. And I'll invite some people I know to take a look at them and give you some feedback. And that tended to result in some really, really high quality work because, again, they knew that experts out there might be looking at this and they took it much more seriously than they would have if it was just something they were submitting to me and then no one else would ever see it. The active learning we talked about before. But if you do an open pedagogy project, here are some issues that always come up. One is, it shouldn't be done just for itself. It should be aligned to what you want students to get out of the course. Even though it's fun to do it, it's good to do it where there's some certain learning objectives. The other is student privacy. Not everyone wants to post materials publicly. What I've done in pretty much every case is I've given the students, well, in the podcast project in particular, I gave students the option of only sharing their work with the class or with a wider audience. And it's been mixed. Probably about half of them are willing to share it publicly. About roughly half would prefer to keep it within the class. And partly that's because they don't really like the sound of their own voice. I couldn't quite get them past that. With the book project, they tended not to be as concerned, partly because they were seniors and they liked having something out there as a sample of work that, you know, they had the ability to edit, to clean up and so forth and polish over the course of the semester. But one thing you can always do, even if you have them work with public blogs, is you could have them use a pseudonym. It doesn't have to be their actual name. They can hide their identity, or giving them some alternative assignment where they don't have to share things publicly if they're worried about, you know, cases of harassment or other issues, and they just don't want public work. You know, there's always ways around that where you can give them equivalent assignments. It is important that you come up with some way, with a plan for students to collaborate. And the first thing I do when I have them work in groups is to sit down with the group and come up with a plan for how they're going to collaborate, how they're going to address conflicts, when they're going to meet, how they're going to meet, whether they're going to meet online using Zoom, whether they're going, well, when we're meeting in person and when we have in-person classes, whether they want to meet in person. But that's the first thing they should do, is talk about how and when and how often they're going to meet, and also how they would resolve conflicts within the group. And having them put together those, essentially a short document describing that process, tends to reduce the conflicts and things later on, because they can always refer back to them. And, you know, if everyone buys into it, it's much less likely there'll be the sort of shirking, or the problems of shirking won't be quite as severe. At least people will feel worse if they're letting the group down a bit because they had agreed to that at the beginning.
You know, I just want to say one thing about that quickly. I find that I started doing this recently, and students they're so confident that they won't have trouble that they just, it's like they don't want to address it. So after hearing what you just said, I think I'm going to give them the scenario and then say, now, what are your strategies for dealing with this? Because in the absence of the concrete instance, they just don't bite. So thanks.
They don't, but then it will happen. And
Yes.
it will always happen
It does.
with some of those groups.
It does.
And another thing that actually, in a workshop that Kristen Croyle put together a couple of years ago, is to periodically, you know, in synchronous meetings, either in person or remotely, just have them work in a breakout room if they're remote and do a little bit of group processing, talk about what's working well, what's not working well, even just 10 or 15 minutes, so they can resolve any conflicts fairly early on before they become more serious, you know, and that also has been helpful. And I don't have to resolve as many issues. You know,
Right.
There's always one group, maybe two groups out of 6 or 7 in a class where you do need to talk to someone a little bit about it. And generally, they're often really apologetic about it. They recognize the problem, and for the most part, it hasn't been as severe of a problem since I've done this little bit of collaboration planning in the beginning. And also come up with a plan for feedback and revision, so that, you know, you don't have to do all the work. You can let students do a lot of the work. And when students hear criticism or suggestions from their peers, and I know that's done in writing all the time, you know, that peer feedback is taken often a lot more seriously than instructor feedback. And also, when they get to see the work that other people are doing, it can serve as an exemplar too, which can help raise the stakes a little bit, that they don't want to do something that's inferior to the work of their peers. Another issue is copyright issues. Addressing that early on is important. In each of the classes where I've used this, we've released things, or the students agreed to release things under a fully open Creative Commons, the maximum freedom of that, where people are free to copy and use it if they want. It hasn't really been much of an issue, but if you are going to create some work that is published, you do want to put some type of a copyright notice on it. Well, there's a slide I've got coming up on that. So we'll come back to that. But intellectual integrity is obviously an issue that, you know, we always have to deal with. But I've seen far fewer problems with this, with group work and with open pedagogy projects than I ever did when students were turning in term papers. If you're going to create something, though, that's public, one issue that you should address before the semester begins or at the very beginning is where you're going to host it and whether it's sustainable. Because if you're going to post something somewhere, you want to make sure that it's going to be there at least for several years. And, you know, some sites can exist indefinitely, or at least as long as we have accounts with the college. You know, you can certainly publish things using the Google services and so forth. And as long as the college continues to be a Google campus and we have access to that, those sites will continue. But if you use, you know, a website, for example, if you're paying for a web service or your department is, those could go away at any point. In the next session, we'll be talking about SUNY Create, which is a hosting which provides essentially web server space. Essentially, it provides server space on which you can host many things. That's a wonderful service, and as long as SUNY continues to fund it, it can last indefinitely. Whether SUNY is able to continue to fund it, though, is always open to question. But we do have funding at least for another year of that. But you'd like things that are posted to be able to exist beyond the semester. And you also, well, as you know, you have to be able to evaluate the individual contributions to group projects and to come up with some way of doing that. And also it's good to teach students a little bit about digital accessibility, because whatever they're going to be doing, if they're going to be posting things in their future employment, wherever that may be, it will have to meet accessibility standards. And, you know, so it's readable by people with screen readers and so forth. And so giving students a little bit of background and some assistance with that can be helpful. The licenses. These are the main types of Creative Commons licenses. And the most general one is just the CC BY license. And so that Creative Commons license just requires that if anyone uses their work, they give you credit for your work, that they don't just copy it and claim it for their own. They have to attribute it to the original authors. That's what my students have chosen each of the last 3 years with the book project. And I hope they continue to, but I've left that entirely up to them. The slightly more restrictive is a share alike platform, which is that anyone can use the material as long as it's shared under a share alike platform. So with the share alike, if someone wants to use your work, they have to also use the work that's derived from your work using a share alike requirement. No one else can put a copyright on work that contains your work, or can put in a more restrictive copyright than that. So, you know, if you create a video, they can post the video as long as it's part of some type of a project that is under the same restriction, that it has to have attribution and that it cannot be used for, well, basically it has to have at least the same level of restrictions. I've said that a couple of times. Okay. The next one is no derivatives. The no derivative restriction is that your work can be shared, but it can't be modified. It can't be edited. It can't be stripped down. This is mostly used with videos or with images. So if you're a photographer and you release things under this requirement, they can't take your image and add things to it. So they can't edit the image. It has to be the original product. So it can't be modified essentially. With the first two licenses, people can modify it. They can take your work and add to it. They can rewrite some of it. They can embed it as long as they give you credit for the original source. Another restriction, which is not that uncommon, which is often used for academic projects, open pedagogy projects, is that you have to get attribution, but it can only be used in non-commercial work. And that's something that I've been surprised that students haven't used. You know, basically it just means that publishers, for example, can't take your work and then publish it, and sell it. So other people are free to copy it as long as they don't charge for it, basically. With the first three of these requirements, people could take your work and publish it in something that's sold. So, if people feel strongly that they don't want people to profit off of their work, then the non-commercial, attribute would be a good one to add. The next one adds a share-alike restriction that you can only share it if it's also released under a share-alike restriction, so that anyone that uses it must share the work in the same way. And then you can combine all of those in the most restrictive of the Creative Commons license, which is they can't modify it, they have to attribute it to you, and they can't make any money off of it. But all of those are still open licenses, are all considered open licenses. And if you go to the source, they can give you little logos you can embed with that are accessible and so forth, where you just get the code from the site and paste it onto your document. And also, I haven't done this, but I probably should. There's a sample student release form for any work that students create where they agree to share it under those conditions. It's something like that. Let me see if I can click on that. There we go. It's basically just a common release form, and it is, you notice, a Creative Commons CC BY license right there. So, that's something you may do. And if you really want to be careful about it, it's probably not a bad practice, so a student can't come back and complain. But basically, if any student ever decided later they don't want their work shared, I just take it down.
Right.
With that Wiki project, I had a student, actually, in that case, the students had the ability to edit their work. I had a student who was from Russia, actually, and he had written some critical things about Marx on the Wiki project. So when he went back after that term, he took all that down because he didn't want that following him,
Right.
which was kind of interesting.
Yeah.
But, if students want to take something down, I'd be happy to do that. So
Right.
now, well, we've talked about this a little bit, but this is a site. Let me just grab this. That has some useful resources, and this is what we put together for that conference a couple of years ago. And where is my chat window? Do
you want me to type the address, the URL in the chat?
Well, I'm not seeing. Yeah, why am I not seeing that? Oh, here it is. Okay, I just wasn't getting the pop-up. It had gone away for the chat. So this is a website which can be helpful. Specifically, the thing that's most helpful here are the open pedagogy resources. And Judy Littlejohn from GCC and I were presenting on this, and we put this together and we periodically update it. We still need to do it a bit more, but here are some of the things that we talked about. And I think there's a couple of things in here that weren't there. One is e-portfolios is another way of sharing work. And that's something that a lot of colleges are using, where students from the time they begin to the time they leave just create samples of the work that they can share with graduate schools or potential employers and so forth. And
that's what we're doing in 391. That's
excellent.
Exactly what we're doing.
And an interesting thing is Desire to Learn has that built in. Now, whether that's activated for SUNY is another question, because they might just start with something a little stripped down and gradually build up, but it does have that capability in a way that Blackboard never did. So, but there's lots of ways of doing it. It could be just student websites could serve as e-portfolios. What are you using for that?
Well, actually, one of the things that the department really wanted was for the students to kind of investigate this themselves and to identify a platform that was suitable. Last semester, a number of students really they gravitated to the Wix platform.
Okay.
But I am actually interested in seeing more of the possibilities. I think Wix seems to encourage something that's less curated. Our students seem to be really, they don't necessarily see this as an opportunity to focus themselves as professionals. They want to sort of feed all of their social world into it. And I think that I think it's great in some ways, but I think there's some liabilities in terms of sort of a professional interface.
Yeah, and both can be useful, but there's probably more benefit to them in terms of that professional interface, where they
Right.
can have samples of the writing, samples of creative work more generally, papers they've written, and so on. And certainly in art, that would be something that would be really valuable.
Right.
So for each of these, we have some examples of work.
Wow.
So here's some examples of blogs that have been used, for example. And there's many more out there, but these were just some that we found that were pretty useful.
Nice.
And then we also have resources in terms of how to do that. So here's an article at Vanderbilt on how you might teach with blogs. Here's one where we talked to someone from Portland, actually, about having students blog in the Haystack community, and so forth. And collections are another thing which students can do in terms of organizing content on the web. A really interesting project is the fashion history timeline, where students there create examples of fashion history, of how things evolved, where with samples, with images or photos of fashion and so forth, along with things being placed in context of why they evolved, the historical period and so forth. And then there was, I forgot where this was. I think it was at, might have been University of Maryland at Baltimore, but I'm not positive. But there's a Baltimore Uprising 2015 archive project. There's the Appalachian Oral History Project interviews and so forth. And this is something that students could pretty easily do. They could create an archive of materials already online or materials they gather. And so that's another type of thing we didn't talk about. Actually, let me see in terms of the examples. Yeah. No, I didn't. It wasn't available at the time. This is a podcast. Let's see if there was a resource with a link. I know at the time it did not have. No, it wasn't ready.
Okay.
Things were moving a bit slowly at that at the time. Again, it was a while ago though. And
sure.
And let me get this whole thing. Oops, I'm just trying to get this thing out of the way here.
Won't X out for you?
Yeah, it's not. Well, I just kept clicking other things and it was trying to put up a poll. Okay. In any case, and that was not what I was trying to do. And online student research projects, podcasts. There's some good examples. Actually, Vanderbilt has something called Vandy Speaks. I think it's called, well, let me just check. Vandy Vox, okay. Where they had a big podcasting project done where many classes participated, and then they have an institution-wide podcast called Vandy Vox, which takes the best of the podcasts from individual classes and shares them publicly. Wow. There's the one I had, but also Rebecca worked on one a couple of years ago with Stephanie Pritchard and some other people, someone who did photography and someone who was working on layout and design, where they had voices of Oswego veterans, where they recorded Oswego veterans, but they also put images up and narration and other things into this whole project. And, again, for each of these, there's some resources like getting started with this, and basically resources that institutions or faculty have put up. Service learning. Here's an interesting, well, this is purely service learning, but the Smithsonian has digital volunteers who take images of script documents and people convert them into text, digitizing them and so forth. And actually, here's a couple of other institutions that do that. Student-created ancillaries. There's a podcast, I'm sorry, there was I don't remember his actual name, but on Twitter, he's that psych professor. He works with Robin DeRosa. He has students create test banks for his class in introductory psychology,
Oh,
which he then shares and so forth.
wow.
So he's devised a system to do that. But you could have students create study guides, have students create videos to share materials and so on. And there's more, but here's some additional resources. The Open Pedagogy Notebook is something that Robin DeRosa and that psych professor, whose name I can't remember, he's in Canada. In any case, if his name will be up there actually, but here's that SUNY Create project, which is in the next session. Here's some examples of SUNY Open Pedagogy projects. If you can scroll through a lot of this. This was put
Wow.
together by a task group that actually I had assembled for SUNY when I was, as the chair of this. And there's quite a few open pedagogy projects that have been going on in SUNY.
Amazing. This is amazing.
So yeah, there's a lot of stuff that, we don't always hear about, and having these groups put it together was helpful. And then we left it open so people could add other resources. And so I had my book creation and the podcast project were posted here at an earlier stage. And this is something that Judy used for her research class, for his history class. We stuck some other things on there, but that's probably the page that's most useful.
I have a quick question.
Sure.
I'm just thinking about, you talked about using PDF, turning student documents into PDFs and then having them use Hypothesis to annotate them. Did you say that has more merit than, say, for example, a Google Doc, where the traces of their input can disappear over time? Is that the value in Hypothesis over, say, Google Docs, Google Drive?
The main value for me, we didn't have it installed when I started in terms of the Blackboard add-in. And the problem I had with having students add comments was that when students got an email that notified that someone had added a comment to their document, they went in and they revised it and deleted and basically the notice of the revision had gone away. So basically I had to be responding to those emails and checking what annotations people had, because I was giving them credit both for the annotations and for the revisions, and I had to be able to see both. And the problem was, students, even though I asked them, I made copies of the documents and asked them not to revise the ones that were being annotated, they still did, because they get a notification, there was a suggested comment, they'd go in, they'd adopt the suggestion, and then it would disappear unless I looked at the history. And the nice thing about the annotations in Hypothesis was that by using a PDF, it froze it at the stage of that draft. So right as soon as the deadline passed, which was usually like a half an hour before the next class meeting, I just downloaded all the documents as PDFs, uploaded them back as Hypothesis documents, and then the document itself at that stage was frozen, and I could see every annotation. Students could go back in and edit their annotations, but they couldn't edit the documents at that stage. So it basically froze the process.
So here's the question I have is, when I did Hypothesis, was like now over a year ago, one of the things, the challenges I remember was that saving them as PDFs so that they were accessible created this, like, it was very time consuming, and often it was like only 75% accessible. So I just remember that was kind of an issue. Is it easier when students are creating documents to convert them into something that's PDF accessible for Hypothesis?
Yes, it was pretty easy to do. Let me just take an example. Let me see where I might have a document.
Yeah,
well,
I don't want to
had
detour you. So
well, no, I mean it's just us here. Let me see. I'm looking at my other thing. I know there was a document in that folder yesterday on podcast, and let me just show you how to set that up. So basically what I used to do is, oh, where's the document in there? I know there was a link in there. Well, let me go. Apparently I didn't save it in the same folder. So let me go
Oh.
over to here. So here's, well, that's a Word document, but it still works. It's in,
Okay.
it's stored as a Google Doc. Basically, all I did is I chose download and chose
Okay.
PDF.
Okay.
And
And then you
then it
could
went
feed
to
it
my
into
download folder.
Hypothesis.
And then I just uploaded into Hypothesis.
But now that reminds me, and we don't have to do this right now, but one of the things I'm remembering is that I think did I use Hypothesis embedded in Blackboard? Like, or it was
Probably.
like you could use it externally or you could use it internally. And I can't remember which way I wound up having to go.
Externally, it is in some ways more flexible because then you could annotate anything online.
Yeah.
If it's internally, the instructor is basically controlling what students annotate. So if you want to use Hypothesis where students are going out and finding resources on the web and adding comments and tagging them for the group, then you have to use the external version of Hypothesis. If you want students to annotate specific documents that are either on the web or embedded in Blackboard, then the embedded version works best.
Yeah.
And
It was internal now that I think about it, right?
yeah. So basically you would just take this and upload it in Hypothesis. Let me just open Blackboard to show how to do that.
Because Hypothesis is built into Blackboard now, right?
It is, yes.
Right.
And we have no idea if that's going to continue when we move to Desire to Learn. I am hoping.
Yeah.
Most likely, well, it would be really stupid to get rid of it.
Right.
The problem is they want everything adopted at a system level. So they want a standard set of tools across all institutions. It's not clear how much flexibility individual faculty will have. I'm just going to take one of my, let me just take a fall class here, and I'll just stick it in a, do I have, let me just put it in a, well, I'll just stick it in here and remember and try to remember to get rid of it later. So what you would do in Blackboard is you would just go to tools and you would scroll down to Hypothesis. Is it under more tools?
It jumps from G to M. Are there some options missing?
No. Okay. So it's not there. Maybe it's under, I haven't done this since the spring of last year, so I'm slipping a little bit here. It might also be under, is it under course tools? I don't think so. No.
I don't remember where it was now either.
Oh, maybe it's under content. Yeah, it is. It's under build content.
Oh, I see. Okay.
So build content, Hypothesis, and then what you would do is you would give it a name, and this would be podcast instructions.
Right.
And then you just submit it, and then you go back to it. You click on it, and we're going to choose select a PDF from Google Drive, and I'm going to go to this account, and I am going. You have to allow it,
right?
And then usually I just do the upload,
right?
And I just get it from my download folder because my Google Drive has about a terabyte of information in it. And so this is in downloads, and once it's up, it automatically defaults to this. You just come over, drag it to there, and then it uploads it, and it's there.
Okay. Nice.
Or it should be there, although it seemed to have opened it instead of.
Yeah.
One more time, I messed up. But basically you just drag it over. Why is it doing that?
Does it want you to select it? Does it go? It doesn't.
Yeah, I guess it does. Yeah, but you should be able to drag it.
Yeah, it seems like you should be. It says you can.
Yeah, well, in any case, as long as you have it sorted from newest to oldest, it'll show up at the top.
Right.
There, and there it is. And now it would be available to students. So basically, I download all of them. I'd have one for each of the group, one document for each of the chapters in that project. And I would just upload them one by one, calling it chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, and so forth, or with the titles.
Right.
And so now it's something that students could annotate. So they could just go in and,
Nice.
and so it works pretty well. And I don't know why I had that issue there with it opening instead of
Weird.
dropping over, but that's,
Thank you.
that's that process.
Yeah, that's faster than I remembered.
So, and the more you do it, the faster it gets. And
Yes.
the last time I did this was probably last May because I didn't use it in my fall classes.
Right. Thank you.
So, are there any other things about open pedagogy projects? Any questions or anything I might have some suggestions on, or?
It's a very basic tool. I think but I have to go in and look at the workshop you did on Google Forms or somebody did. I can't remember now who's done it, because I don't, I have struggled to create those. And I know yesterday when I went to the attendance session, I realized that, Michael was really talking about face-to-face settings. And I do want to know my students and get to know them by name, but I feel like at times, at least online, going through attendance is just soul killing for them. So I thought about whether I could use Google Forms in some way to do that. And that's not really connected to open pedagogy. So I thought I would go and hunt that down when I have some time and we're not on this recording.
Yeah, actually, just as an aside, you don't even need to take attendance if you're doing it on Zoom, because if you go to the reports, you can see a list of everyone who was there and how long they were there.
So go to the report. I think I'm not sure I know how to go to. You mean go right into Zoom?
Go right into Zoom, but into the Zoom website. So you go to, because that's how we take attendance on these workshops. You go into that, you log into your account. I'm already logged in, but if you go to reports, you can look at not the meetings, but actually the usage reports, I'm pretty sure. You can go to the settings and you can see this workshop, for example, had 15 people. Well, I don't think there's any harm doing it. And these were the 15 people who attended, and you've got it right there. And it all has their email addresses. And so, well, either the names or the email addresses or both.
Nice. Okay, well, that does save some time. I mean, I because so few have been on camera, I have used it to do a sound check. So I've used the sound check to verify that they're actually there and not just turning their computer on and disappearing.
I know, I hate that.
Yeah. So there's a mixture of, but I really like the idea that I can look at the document. That's helpful. So Google Forms is just something I need to really play around with for other reasons.
It's a very quickly. It's really easy to use. All you do is you go to, new. While you're in a Google Drive folder, Google Forms, create and share, and then you just start adding questions. You give it a name. So this could be a student survey. And then you could put a description if you'd like. So this is to find out more information about you or whatever, but you just go down and you type a question. It could be multiple choice, or you can just change it. You could put in a short answer or ask them for something longer. Let's say, let's say you want to ask, what did I do? Let's say
I was like, well, that's cool.
Yeah, that wasn't intended. I'm getting a little bit careless, but but you could just put in some type of a question here. You could say, what are your primary concerns about this class, or something like that.
Right.
And then if you want to do similar types of things, you could just click on the duplicate, or you could just go down and you could click on the plus over here to add another question. And they could be check boxes if you just want to check off multiple things. It could be a drop down if they're choosing from a list. You could have them do a file upload. So that's what I do when I have them submit their documents or their recordings. I have them do a file upload of the transcript of the audio, and it all shows up in a spreadsheet where it uploads it to your Google Drive account, and it has links that are in the spreadsheet with all the responses. So all you have to do is you have the name of the student, and then all the responses are a row in there, and you just click on the link and you can listen to it or view their documents. It makes it a really way of collecting a lot of information
for
all in one
aggregating
place.
things. Now, I mean, but the first question could be name, right? Like you could literally, it's wide open. You have to, if you want to know who it is, you have to ask them to put their name in.
Yeah, but you could also in the settings, it could be. One of the things you could do is one of the options, where is it? Is it under? Yeah, one of the options is you could choose it to collect email addresses by default, and then they have to be logged into some Gmail account. It could be the college one, or it could be a different one. But that way it would automatically do it without them having to type it, or you could ask them.
Right, because some of them have email addresses that don't correspond to their names.
Right. So what you may want to do then is just ask them for their name, or their preferred name, or or both.
That was one of the things that I'm concerned about, is that students, that conversation about naming. I was in another session about how, in the session with Shelley, about how if students have a name they want to be called that's not the name on the roster. So I want to really try to use this to kind of gather that information.
You could ask them for their preferred name, their pronouns, and so forth. And it's no more difficult than just going here and clicking something like this, and then just putting in a new question where this is the text of the question. And then if it's multiple choice, you just type each option and keep clicking add option until they're all there. Or if you want to do check boxes. So if there's multiple categories that apply, you could put them all there, and then it will all show up in the spreadsheet as the results. And then when you're done, all you have to do is you go to, you could use it as a quiz. You can go over to here to choose how the responses. You could, again, let students, you could restrict it to Oswego users or not. I usually turn that off so that they don't have to be logged into their Oswego email account, because a lot of students will. Purple is on. So this is the default. So I normally turn that off before I share it. So that way, since a lot of students will respond from their smartphones are normally connected to a Gmail account, which is not their Oswego account. And this way they can do it without having to log into their Oswego account.
Got it.
And you could let people get a copy of it. I mean, that's how we do registration for these. I just create a form with the whole listing of all these things.
When I've done, so I think one of the confusions I have is when it's done, how do I circulate it? How do I save it and circulate it? That's what I don't understand.
Okay. And it's a little bit different than the last time I saw this. There should be an option for sharing it. Is it over? Oh,
it's on the right.
It's I was missing that. I'm sorry.
That's
I was just getting, it's because I dragged it from my other window, which is wider. It's under send. So you got options there. You could send it as an email directly, or what I normally do is I just grab the link. And again, you can shorten it if not, or you could just copy it and then just put it in an email and send it to the class, or post it in Blackboard, or put in a link on Blackboard to it.
Or in the chat. Sometimes I like to drop things in the chat. Okay.
And then you might want to shorten it just so it doesn't look as intimidating. So just copy and paste that right in the chat and ask them to fill it out.
And will I get periodic? It'll just like. they'll
it-
just roll in, and then at a certain point I can see them all.
So what will happen is you can choose to create a spreadsheet, which is probably the easiest way to do
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
And then it does it I didn't give it a name, so it's just
Right.
going to say untitled form, but you just click create. And then if you go there, you'll see all the responses. If I
Got it.
go to my drive, I should see, for example,
There it is.
yeah, except there's nothing in there. But if we go to, it's not sorted alphabetical. There we go. If I go down to, there we go. If I go here, just to show you an example of this, we go to the winter breakout. This is the registration spreadsheet that's created that lists for each workshop all the people who attended. So,
Right.
and the way I send out the emails is I just sort each of them by the responses, and then I just copy and paste all those emails into an email and send it out with a reminder, or to add the people to the calendar. So it all shows up in here.
Wow, great. Yeah, I've never been a big user of spreadsheets. So, but I see increasingly how valuable they are. So they seem pretty straightforward. Now this thing with the, what do you call that? That
the QR code.
Yeah, I don't understand that at all. And now I'm on record saying that. So
okay, do you have your smartphone?
I do, but it's not. I do, but I don't think I have that capacity. I don't even think I have the room to download the app for this.
You don't need an app. What is it? An Android or an iPhone?
It's an Android.
Okay, how old is it?
It's about 2 years, a year and a half old.
Then it should work. Just aim the camera at the screen, right where that image is.
Okay.
And what should happen is you should get a little pop-up with a URL.
No, not happening. How close do I have to be to it?
So that is a big portion of the screen, that QR code.
Okay. I'm sort of running out of space on my phone. That might be why.
No, it may depend on, it depends on which version of Android you're using. Now, students though, most of them will have a version of Android. All iPhones for the last 5 years will do this. And most recent, the last couple of years of Android operating system should do this. But if students don't have that, Snapchat does. And all students will tend to have Snapchat.
Right.
So if they open up Snapchat, they just hold the camera to it. What will happen is you'll get a URL appearing right on the image. You tap it and it opens that site. So with a Google form, if you took that URL, you could generate, you could generate it right from here, actually. If you click on this thing in Chrome.
Yeah, I have seen that, right.
You can choose to copy the link, or you could make a QR code that you can then download, and that will then be something you could paste so that other people could read it.
So the merit of this is that it's cutting down on a step. Is that it?
Yeah, basically, it's a quick way to share a URL with people.
Right. Thank you very much.
So they don't have to type it in. They don't have to find the chat if they're working from a smartphone. They can just go directly to the site.
Right. Great. Thank you. Hi, Zach.
Okay, so we should probably end this session. We did go off on some other topics, but that was actually
fantastic.
a more productive use of time.
Thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome. Now, Zach, we're going to have to exit for just a minute so we can get this video ready.